decision. Yeah, he didn't face his parents who believed in him.
Right. I mean, the death of his father is somewhat instrumental in this tragedy, and I'm just trying to say, like, a lot of the questions are introducing more questions than we can address at this point. So I don't know where we should sort of like go into depth. For example, at Mark's question, where Mark has a sort of a very comprehensive sort of criticism of stuff that's going on. We can't address it if we keep going from question to question. So we have to. I have no problem with this because as we get Kleist haben, Kleist has this I don't know if it's a theory, but it's sort of a way of thinking. It's called the allmähliche Verfertigung des Gedankens beim Reden. It's sort of like the idea of this conversation was, in the course of our conversation, we would come to a common language, if not a common understanding of what we're talking about. But now we have so many already cemented terminologies that are sort of getting thrown at each other. I don't know which cemented terminology we should change. But I think we should probably open up more of the questions rather than go from maybe question to question. I don't know.
I agree with Steve that it will come together. It's like a puzzle.
Yeah, we've got time.
That's the Hegelian approach to history. In the end, everything will turn out fine.
I think so. And you know, we are all used to trying to make order of thinking, and so I think in the course of the 2 days, things will come together.
I think this is a good moment to brainstorm, and we'll see.
Right.
We'll see what we want to talk about this afternoon.
I wanted to respond to what Sylvia said because I really liked how you framed that. I wrote my dissertation on tragedies written by women, and a long time ago. And Steve actually thought that it might be a good idea if I contribute something to this volume, and I just didn't get my act together. But I also had the problem that the women, and there are about 100 tragedies by German women writers, most of them unknown. The problem has to do with what Sylvia says, that in order to be heard as a speaker, like the African one-legged men, you have to have a common language. And the women that were not allowed to go to university, not allowed to be part of the circle of gentlemen that were conversing about these things in this, you know, long history of tragedy that we are dealing with, were not speaking the same language. And the women who tried, because they knew they were sort of standing outside the door, like the first women who were allowed to do doctorates were literally sitting outside the door of the seminar because they were not supposed to be in the same room with the guys, right? Like Dorothea Leopoldina, so because their womanhood could somehow taint the clean thinking of the men. So they were outside, but they knew that very much, of course, and they wanted to show that they could be inside. And so the tragedies that I've read very much try to be what the theory says they should be, right? They're really making an effort to join the chorus, to join the language of the men, and thus fail because they are not part of that experience. They are not. So I think it took another 100 years or 200 for people like Jelinek to say, I'm not joining the club. I have to start with my own experience, and I have to start with women's experience. And that's now finally possible, and it's sort of been elevated, but it's still an issue. And of course, even more so when you look at other diversity elements here. So I think, you know, this is a part of the problem that we're going to be talking about when we talk about problems of tragedy, right? That it is a very exclusive.
So if you don't have a voice, then you're denied, basically denied tragedy.
Right.
If it's a hermeneutical accomplishment, Anke, and then first Anke.
In order to create more chaos.
Thank you.
I'd like to put the question to everybody to sort of figure out what medium actually narrates tragedy. And it goes back to Sylvia's comment, also goes back to
Josh.
Josh. Because if you think there are trans-historical limitations to the term label tragedy, I think there are transmedial limitations to tragedy. And so my question would be, you know, does it necessarily have to be a medium of language that comes out in literature? Does it have to be limited to philosophy? And we might have to. Or are there narrations possible with the example you provided, whereby the homeless person, I assume that's the image you had in mind, holds up a picture, a photograph, and that was hinted at the volume 2. What medium do we use to actually mediate experiences of tragedy? Are there limitations? Would we have a video game that could be called tragic, or do we hit the limit and say, you know what, just as much as trans-historical doesn't necessarily work, transmedia doesn't work either. So do we need to make those limitations and acknowledge, listen, it's simply in the theatrical, literary, and philosophical realm that we can really talk about tragedy?
Well, to clarify, the way I understand Steve, when you talked about expression, you didn't limit expression to literature because that's why we talk about music and
Right.
painting.
Joe's example of bluegrass is a really
Right.
interesting one.
So to give this, whatever it is, this experience,
Or painting.
expression,
It's expression, and that's the question, you know, what narration are we talking about? Is it using the medium of language, or can we talk about, all right, here's a video essay that can narrate tragedy as well?
that's the form of language. Yeah.
That's the question, you know, what language are we talking about? What form of expression are we talking about? And then what medium channels that particular experience, and who then actually labels it a tragedy? Can we, I mean, this goes back to, I think it's the Josh or Joe issue as well, so it becomes a phenomenological one, you know, who is looking at what, how? I'm trying to create
No,
more.
let me try to summarize your question. Like, who has the authority to say something is tragic and something is not tragic? That's one of the expressions for
There's certainly a question of authority.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So obviously, it's going to be a professor, that's clear.
Gregor. Gregor.
All right. I think we should, I would like to challenge this notion that it seems that there seems to be this semantic universal tragic, right? And I don't think there is such a thing. I think that tragedy means so many different things in so many different contexts, right? And so we've already got the sense that we're dealing with a moving target. So I'm not sure if historical semantics would be helpful here, or other ways. I think we have to really look into the different notions of the tragic. When we do that, we have to also consider the German context. And when we talk about semantics, we have to move beyond English semantics and look not only at the semantics of the word tragic and tragedy, but in a hit-and-run accident in Düsseldorf, say, would they also use the word Tragödie and tragisch? I'm not sure. So those are things that we, I think, should keep in mind. But I find this very interesting to talk about and to discuss, to have a Gespräch about the different notions of the tragic. But I think the plurality needs to be emphasized. The fact that we're dealing with a moving target.
Huang, and then Jennifer.
Yeah, first of all, I'm very happy to be here to join this conversation. This is not to further complicate this universe of tragic language. It's actually, my question is more a kind of follow-up about tragedy as an experience or as an artistic form of dealing with an experience. My question is that whether this tragic experience it always refers to a kind of individual level or a collective level. This goes back to some comments about the ethical, historical, and political implications of tragedy and the tragic. Me personally, I'm very interested in the tendency of tragedy as a genre or as a form of overcoming the individual dimension of and pointing toward a collective dimension. Even when we, in common language, dealing with a kind of something more in kind of daily or conversational level, when you say something is tragic, I feel it always points to even a kind of collective memory. For example, kind of something we shared by a community. Of course, going back to the Greek tradition, tragedy is about community, is about the city-state. So I'm very interested in raising this question about the individual dimension, personal suffering, and the collective dimension.
By the way, does the word or concept of tragedy have much currency in ordinary Chinese conversation?
It is translated from this Western tradition. And the reason why I'm so interested in this conference is that it is primarily translated from Greek tradition and German tradition. So there's no place for Hasim, but there's a place for Hegel's idea of and Nietzsche's ideas of tragedy.
Jennifer?
Earlier I had said that we just probably have to live with the fact that we use tragedy, the word tragedy in an everyday sense, and that's not going to go away. We're going to read it in the newspaper forever. And that's going to irk us, probably because of exactly the questions that we're raising. Is tragedy simply suffering? I think most of us are saying tragedy isn't simply suffering. The question is what level of reflection, if that's even the right word, and what kind of reflection is useful for us to talk about when we speak about not only literature and art, but modern times and the human suffering that we can visit in our own world now. So given, if we're going to at least sort of live with that difference and say that tragedy, whatever medium, though I appreciate the question, I think that's a tough one as well, involves some kind of level of reflection, whether that be narrative, whether that be philosophical contemplation. We've already brought together some of the elements which are often implied in making sense of that suffering. For example, the question of democracy, freedom, responsibility, human action. Those are parts of the aspect of the reflective that we have taken up. Community just came up as well. One thing that we haven't yet mentioned that I think is also an implicit background of any kind of reflection on human suffering or even catastrophic human suffering is that tragedy at this reflective level requires a presumption of human flourishing against which catastrophe can be contrasted. And that, I think what would be worse than tragedy is to have that, what we've been calling that kind of raw suffering, where there's no longer a means to contrast it with what could be or what should be, with the possible. What do we expect of human life? What is the non-tragic circumstance?
Can I just quickly respond to that? Because for me, when I mentioned Stephen King, I think like the tragedy with the Kennedy assassination is not what happened, but what didn't happen because it happened. That's what you're saying, right? And I think that this reflection is, we have an expectation which is, reflected or non-reflected, but it's somehow present. And the more reflected it is, the more things can appear tragic. The less reflected, the less tragic things appear. If there's no expectation that an ant is important, you run over an ant, it's not tragic. A kid gets run over, your expectation the kid could grow up to be a great musician or whatever, it's more tragic.
Right, I mean, just to jump in there briefly, human death is not tragic.
No, it's just...
Human death is a fact of humanity.
Oh, you don't want to talk about facts. So before.
No, human death is a fact. It's not an experience. Human death is a fact of humanity.
Well, maybe Heidegger would tell you it could be an experience too, I don't know.
Human death is the end of the suffering.
Yes, indeed. So that's...
Happiness.
Human death...
Heidegger.
I don't know. I'll let you know. But and I think that I think it's right that we resist the overuse of the word tragic. I mean, getting cancer is sad. It is not tragic. What can be tragic, though, is that fate or circumstance in the context of a life, in the context of what could have been, in the context, and so it is the way in which it is narrated, it is the way in which it is thought about, it is the way in which it is reflected on, and of course that can be done in life as well as art.
So Karsten, Wolfram, and Jeff, and then Mark, and then Gregor.
Oh, and Abby.
Okay, sorry.
Abby at the end, okay.
Karsten.
Yeah, I want to return to the title of this session. It was called The Pursuit of Unhappiness, Do We Live in Tragic Times? It seems to me we have lost a little bit track of the title of this session and wandered all over as a result. I think to speak first of all, the pursuit of unhappiness raises all sorts of interesting questions which have not come up. I mean, isn't it happiness which we ordinarily seek? Why pursue unhappiness? One might now quote Hölderlin and speak of Tapfer vergessen. Isn't that what is the appropriate response here? Why dwell on all sorts of nasty things? We haven't mentioned much the Holocaust and the 2 world wars and so on. What's the proper response to these? Is it Tapfer vergessen, or is it dwelling on them? That's an important question. What's the proper response, which I thought, given the other part of the title, do we live in tragic times? If tragic is used in the dictionary definition, where it means just something which causes distress, then the answer is obviously yes, in all sorts of ways. And I think we can draw these distinctions, I agree with, between the simply horrific and the tragic, where the tragic suggests agency, suggests possibilities of having something turn out differently if only people had acted differently in the past. But there's a hope then in that very way of looking at things. I think that came up, and I agree with that. I think we can take that pretty much for granted. One question is raised by what came up in the beginning when there was talk about Erlösung, Selbsterlösung, and so on. Art, Kunst als Erlösung, Kunst als Selbsterlösung. I don't think we can redeem ourselves through art. I think that is something worth talking about. Or when we mention Selbsterlösung durch Kunst, we should remember something that Kant said in the Critique of Judgment. Why do we create art in the first place, including tragedy? We create it to share. And he suggests that such sharing founds community. And I think the only Selbsterlösung, if there is such a thing, that is possible is through the other. It's really, we need the other who has to help us to uns selbst erlösen. So I think we have forgotten or shortchanged the way that, as Kant puts it, art builds culture. He says, indeed, that finally is the way we assess the progress of culture, by its ability to even, he says, the most trivial experience in itself quite meaningless can become profoundly meaningful by being shared, by being expressed through art. That's what builds culture. And I think in part, tragedy is a way of building community, and that's the only Selbsterlösung that is possible to us, I want to say.
What you've just done for me is you've given me a definition of the word converse. You've redefined the word converse for me, because con is the other, and verse is the creative activity. So I think the conversation that we have is basically what you try to describe with different words. I just used the words that Steve gave me with Converse, the rubber company. But but you asked another question. You don't think art can redeem us? Can something else redeem us? Or we can't redeem ourselves?
I think just creating art, the individual to think, and some artists have certainly thought of it, that kind of art turns out to be an art which is bought at the price of reality. You can indeed do something like turn your back on reality, find refuge in an aesthetic reconstruction, lose yourself to that construction. This could, by the way, open into a discussion of kitsch, and especially of sour kitsch. I think a lot of rumination about even the Holocaust, I'm afraid, falls into the category of sour kitsch. Hermann Bloch made a very important distinction when he distinguished between Süße and sour kitsch. I'm very fond of that distinction. But I think that if art is redemptive, then only precisely by building community, by through this share. So it's not art as such that is redemptive. It is an art that takes seriously the other.
Quick comment by Felicitas.
Thank you very much for what you said. It's just one sentence. I mean, I thought that was quite clear. The sentence, erlöse dich selbst, sonst erlöst dich keiner. I mean, that's sheer irony, of course. I mean, not a single second do I believe in redemption by art. That would be absurd. And this is why I've come up with the Gespräch and the Zwiesprache, and that opens up to community. Because I do not believe in la pour la either, so that wouldn't work. So it could be a sort of consolation, but never redemption. And when I talk about Arbeit, because the topic of Arbeit came up, of course I make fun of that. Selbsterlösung ist reine Arbeit. This is a state of many artists in our society, and it's really, it's not very pleasant. And when I talk about something not being pleasant, I don't mean that it's that things should be pleasant, but it's terrible. It's terrible because it's torture and it's the contrary of freedom. And so the remark, it's part of my work, like in Johanna is a sentence in Hoppe, kröne dich selbst, sonst krönt dich keiner. And I think it's just playing with the idea that we can do it all by ourselves. Of course we can't. So without community or Zwiesprache, nothing. Just so that there's no misunderstanding that I come to make propaganda for Selbsterlösung. This is none of my business.
But, okay.
Wolfgang and Mark, and then I'll see how much I can remember.
Yeah, I want to add something to what Jennifer said. I agree absolutely to the idea that in the word tragic, or in the form of tragedy, there is a presumption of human flourishing, as you call it. And just want to add that the heyday of tragedy as a literary form is always in ages of optimistic ages of enlightenment. You have Athens in the 5th century, you have Elizabethan England, you have German Democratic Republic of the 50s and 60s, and you have the USA of Eugene O'Neill, something like that. Yeah, and I think tragedy has to do with the dialectics of freedom and necessity, and it has to do with the dialectics of enlightenment and counter-enlightenment, or enlightenment and fate. And I think only if you have this historic constellation, which is normally a constellation of these in optimistic ages, you have a situation in which tragedy as a literary form can flourish.
Yes.
I mean, this point here.
Just as a tiny response, I would only say, so my answer to do we live in tragic times would be, I hope so.
Yeah.
Because suffering is absolutely undeniable. We live in a time full of suffering. But if we can't have tragedy,
I doubt it.
Yeah, exactly. But I doubt it. I hope so, but I'm skeptical that we do. But I hold out a hope for that. I hope that we do, because that means that there lives a sense of our assumptions about what should be for human life.
Mark, then Abby, then Gregor, then Rob.
I want to offer a brief meta-reflection on the discussion up until now. I think it would be helpful to distinguish, at least implicitly, between a descriptive definition of tragedy and a normative definition of tragedy. I agree with Gregor. There are family resemblances. Tragedy is almost a homonym. It means different things. In the 1920s, Lovejoy wrote an essay called On the Discrimination of Romanticisms. You could imagine a similar essay today on the meaning of tragedy in different cultures, Germany and the US, across time, the way a common person would use it, the way a scholar might use it. And it's not the same, it's clear. One could discriminate those on a descriptive level. What's interesting to me on the normative level is that most of the reflections imply a normative understanding of tragedy. Tragedy at its best is, or tragedy should be, X. And we've heard the role of work, the role of democracy, solidarity, community. We hear language such as tragedy should be, it's not sad, it's tragic, or it's sad, it's not tragic, etc. And that is the more interesting question to me, whether tragedy is a dialectic, something I would support. And an interesting question to me is, are these different concepts compatible with one another? Some perhaps yes, some perhaps not. And if so, in what ways? Are they simply dimensions of tragedy? Are they pointing to elements? And is there a unifying definition that could capture most of what we're talking about on a normative level, as in tragedy should be X.
Abby, Gregor, then Helmut.
So I'm really learning a lot, and as I'm scribbling and thinking as I'm listening to all of you. And so two things. The first thing is that it occurs to me that I learn about tragic and tragedy from tragedies, from literature, from art. I think, when I think about genocide, suicide, terrible accidents, I was going to say tragic accidents, but terrible accidents, they don't teach me about tragedy. They teach us maybe about human resilience. They teach us about whatever, but not about tragedy per se. So to keep that division separate. So when I think of literature, what strikes me as is different literary models. So in our core curriculum at BU, we teach Ajax. It's a wonderful book to teach to freshmen. It's a wonderful play to teach if you're trying to explain, what tragedy is and the concept of tragedy. So Ajax commits suicide right in the middle of the play. And so you can ask, well, why does the suicide come in the middle and not at the end? Well, because, he takes us into the abyss, and you're in the abyss of this horrible, acts that occurred. And then, what is the second half of the play? Well, can we bury Ajax or not? It's really a very wonderful metaphor for, the work, or the reflection, or the coming to terms, and the Bewältigung. Will the Greeks be able to? Will they forgive Ajax? Will they agree to bury him? That's the Gespräch. And then I think about the book of Job, which is, I think, a very interesting and different. So Job, you have the tragedy right at the beginning, and then you have the middle books, which are all conversations. But these conversations are not effective. Job doesn't get comforted by these conversations. They're banal, they're cliches, they're Job's friends trying to comfort him. There's lots of expression of grief and debate about, what could I have done and why did this happen to me? But it's sort of Gespräch as being not helpful Gespräch. The helpful, what happened, but ultimately at the very end, when Job gets his direct conversation with God, and he gets the voice of God talking to him. And that is the resolution. And we still don't really understand what it means, what Job's words at the very end mean. But he gets some kind of answer from God, from the source of his suffering, of his tragedy. So a different model. And then I'm wondering if anyone has read Life After Life by Kate Atkinson, which is, did anybody read it? New novel by this amazing Scottish writer, Kate Atkinson. So, it's a tremendously experimental novel that figures essentially a young woman who dies and is reborn many, many times throughout the novel. And the time frame is the early 20th century in England. It's basically World War I and up to World War II. But there are many tragedies that happen and then they're reverted. And I think it's such an incredible literary experiment. And just to tantalize you to reading it, on the very first page of the novel, the heroine Ursula shoots a bullet at Adolf Hitler. I mean, talking about averting catastrophe. That happens on the very first page.
Begins with catharsis.
So, and it's a book that I don't even have a vocabulary for. I can barely understand how she wrote it, let alone really interpret it. But I think the question of tragedy is drama and other media, tragedy in the novel, and how a form can evolve to respond is also really interesting.
Gregor, then Helmut, then Klaus.
Actually, Mark made my point already, so I don't see more. Making Mark talk about the prescriptive and the descriptive approach, and I think I agree with Mark that the more interesting is the descriptive approach, not the prescriptive approach. Tragedy has to be this. Well, I'm not going to call it tragedy.
I get confused easily. So, what's the difference between descriptive and prescriptive? Because, for example, in German language, things that if you use it often enough, what was descriptive becomes normative. So, it's not as clear as I would like it to be clear because clarity helps me, but I don't think it's that clear.
Well, actually, there's a certain dialectic going on. You just described it. That is, you know, when you think of the meaning of words, right? Meanings are not fixed. Meanings are in constant change. And then, you know, communities just agree that this is the meaning of the word, right? To make love.
Wait, yeah, no, I'm just trying to understand what, like, if I understood Mark correctly, Mark said there was clarity about this is normative and this is not normative. And now if we're saying it's dialectical, then we're saying it's not as clear as Mark suggested. Maybe.
Well, here's a normative idea of tragedy. People say that tragedy is not possible in the modern world because according to the Aristotelian definition, a person has to fall from a great height, and the people no longer exist on a great height. And so someone like Arthur Miller comes along and confronts the normative definition and says, well, I'm going to give you a tragedy, and the hero is Willie Loman. The normative definition would be the Aristotelian definition. And in fact, my question to you is that I don't quite understand the connection between tragedy and democracy in the Greek conception. I mean, it seems to me that Aristotle's conception of the tragic as an aristocratic bias. It's a fall from the great height.
Yeah.
And only people who are up here deserve to be called tragic. So maybe you can explain the connection.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's a sociological fact that for, I don't know, 100 years you've had citizens of, not just citizens, but women, slaves, ambassadors, visitors going to these performances. So they were going to these performances and being affected by it. And certainly these performances of tragedy in ancient Greek polis were considered political. They were considered politically important enough that I think under Pericles, tickets were subsidized so that even the poorer citizens could attend them. So even if you have the presentation of Agamemnon and so on, there's something happening with the audience in response to those stories. I mean, you can have aristocratic heroes, but they can be nested within a form of art that has strong democratic consequences. Solidarity is one of them, right? Educative. Yeah, and also agency. I think that was another freedom. I mean, the whole idea of agency, a democratic polis has to learn how to act. And one of the ways it learns how to act and understand unintended consequences and so on is to see these tragedies.
But I think that's not an effective answer, quite. Because you could also point out that the saints of the Middle Ages came off from nobility, but they were for the people. So I think the fact a lot more needs to be said before that answer becomes convincing. I'm not convinced either by the democratic character of Attic tragedy.
Well, you can say that the fall from the great height is a kind of level. That is, the king is leveled to the condition of other of ordinary human beings.
You can also point out that Aristotle was living 80 years after writing, 70 years after the Golden Age of tragedy, and didn't actually experience any of the tragedies that in their first performance. Aristotle is only one conception of tragedy. It's not the Greek conception of tragedy.
I want to just make a perhaps apologetic plea for the Greek conception of tragedy as democratizing. It's certainly the case that the content of the tragic plays are aristocratic. It's certainly clear that Aristotle is writing in an aristocratic time, to the extent that lots of people saw the play, and the Greek tragedy is always a presentation rather than, or I would say is a kind of mode of discourse as opposed to a structure of existence. There's always a kind of a pedagogical function to it. And that pedagogical function, I take it, is what you were talking about when you were saying that women and slaves, and even in a non-democratic society, there's a kind of democratizing function to it, which I think brings the two together. This may be similar to what Kant and Schiller, just to now jump ahead 1,000 years, mean when they talk about art as a symbol of morality. There's a kind of
there's an educative function to art that they're holding on to, which means that I think they're in some way exhibiting a kinship with a Greek conception of tragedy. I don't know if that answers the question you were asking.
Well, it answers it to some extent. I think we can say that human beings have always demanded ideal images by which to measure their actions. Even fairy tales could be discussed in these terms.
Yeah.
And often they end up with somebody becoming a princess or whatever. So I think that point can be granted. I don't think that we can move very quickly from that to the word democracy. And that, I thought, was too easily done.
Could I pick up on what you were saying and what we're trying to say? I guess, like, in the Aristotelian definition, one of the key elements, as far as I know, is like identification. So you identify with people up here, not with people down here. That's the way it seems to work. If I look at another time, another place, another suggestion would be, I tried to write about The Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, which for me would be a tragedy. It has classical structure in the end. We have a drug addict who is under severe pain, and he wants to free himself from his addiction, but the doctors offer him the things that would make him addicted to stop his pain. So it's a classical, like if I take it, I'm addicted again. If I don't take it, I'm suffering from my pain. So it's a sort of a classical, Hegel could probably like this. It's very difficult for most people in this room probably to identify with a drug addict, right? So that could be very democratizing because maybe there are more drug addicts rather than are kings. So that would be more democratic. So I think that there are a lot of things that we have to sort of rethink because maybe at one time it made good sense. To me, the question that you've asked, like the pursuit of happiness, that makes to me, the pursuit of happiness makes absolutely no sense to me. It's a pathological situation. So I don't think we're talking about pursuing unhappiness. We're talking about tragedy. We're talking about something else, like I think what you referred. But there's this twist to it too. You have Nietzsche's trying to say like his answer. Unfortunately I don't live in tragic times, right? I live in a time that's not capable of tragedy. Tragedy is a capability of something that people, not everybody can do. You have to be really great to be able to write a tragedy. We live in tragic times if the tragic times are measured, and do we use the word tragic a lot? I think we live in tragic times. Every day in the newspaper we live in tragic times. But what I'm not sure about here is like where we locate this desire. Like you said, I wish we lived in tragic times. Well, if that means I wish we had more people so we could see more people suffering, that makes absolutely no sense to me. So I'm trying to figure out what we mean. When I read this thing we talked about together, we had sort of like, we'll get to it this afternoon, which is going to happen soon enough.
That's right.
The question is like, should we ontologize this idea about tragedy? Like suffering is just part of life. No matter what we do, we're going to suffer. There's always going to be tragedy. When we're dead, there'll be another conversation about tragedy because it will just continue forever. Or is there some hope that there will not be tragedy because we can do something to at least prevent the preventable parts of our tragedy? Some things that we call tragic are preventable, right? I think that's part of it too. Is it an aesthetic situation we're talking about, or is it a political imperative coming from Sapere Aude? Should we use whatever reason we have to prevent at least preventable tragedies, right? And I think that conversation has to come up at some point.
We got to wrap up before lunch here pretty soon. Helmut and then Klaus, and then I think we wrap up. What time is it?
We wrap up at 12. We wrap up.
Yeah.
We won't be able to turn coffee into wine at the first coffee break because we missed it.
Carsten Harry's earlier comment about the way in which tragedy helps create a community made me think about this question in the world of Jewish history, where there's a very famous book by Yerushalmi called Zachor, which many of us have probably read. And there the argument is that if you're asking the question, how do we bring a serious attitude towards the suffering of others, that the Jewish tradition and other traditions as well have many ways of doing this, and that there are modern and early modern ways, and that we, thinking about tragedy, maybe discount some of these other ways, some of these other traditions, like limitations, like memorial books, like rituals in which the community remembers a certain kind of suffering without applauding it as tragic. Yeah. And this is maybe interesting in terms of this question of how democratic is tragedy, Because if you think about it, those memorial books, the ones that I've seen anyway, they, for example, of German towns which were wiped out during the devastations around the Black Death and so on, they list individual community members simply as a list, much as we do in the Vietnam Memorial Monument. And this whole question of how do you list the dead and how do you materialize that suffering, in war memorials, it's also very modern, again, that 19th century phenomenon that the soldiers who die in war are listed on stone. And this was not the case in the 18th century. So I think we have to think about the tragic as a form which, in a way, erupts in certain times and certain possibilities against a wide band of other forms of bringing certain kind of seriousness called suffering to the table.
Klaus, and then Mark, and then we stop, and then Karen, and then we stop. Karen. Actually, what Karen has to say, I think, has direct relevance to helmets. Maybe we should skip it.
I was intrigued by the earlier question about could there be a tragic video game? And I wondered, do we find it legitimate if the audience is ascribing a tragic meaning? Just to throw out two examples, post-war examples. A BBC study of what was the saddest work of music was Barbara's Adagio for Strings, which was used in several state funerals, but in its original context as a movement within a string quartet. There's nothing particularly tragic about it. There's nothing programmatic that makes it tragedy. Or Penderecki's Threnody to Victims of Hiroshima was a work that originally had a different title and had nothing to do with Hiroshima, but someone suggested to him that it reminded them of Hiroshima. And so then he applied that title, and it's probably the most famous work commemorating World War II. And there seems to be an authenticity, even though there's nothing within from the creative process that would bring that tragedy. So would that be a degraded form of tragedy, or is there something authentic when the community is ascribing the tragic meaning? So that's a question I would ask about tragic times today.
Klaus, and then Mark, and then we break.
What I find very important, what came up on politics, collective memory, and democracy is that I think tragedy also thematizes above all, from the beginning one could say, what does not belong to a democracy or to a polity. I mean, Aristotle famously said the one who is a polis, who is not part of a polis, is either a beast or a god. And to a certain degree, you know, when you look at Sophocles, for sure, the idea is always that the one who belongs to a community or to a collective memory is highly questionable. It is also, you know, always addresses the idea of those who do not belong or who are too monstrous to belong. Oedipus himself, but clearly also in Antigone, the idea of being too monstrous for this community. It explodes, you could say, community. It dissolves it, it doesn't recover it. You know, historically speaking, the Hellenistic festivities allowed for competitions from non-democratic states. I mean, the Tragidians weren't, besides the Echelons, not necessarily Democrats. And I think this is why I cherish what happens in the 18th century with people such as Büchner or the destitution of Wojciech, or the monsters we encounter in Penthesilea, or Amphitryon, or you know, the Hannah Arendt centers her political philosophy on the pariah, on the refugee, on the stateless. Completely new perspectives on what tragedy on its margins thematizes, and then we have to ask, right, it is ultimately the goat song. I mean, the question of bestiality and of the animal, of creation as such, of the creaturely life. Is it, does it have a vote? Does the unconscious have a vote, so to say, in community? Is it registered in any form of collective memory? I think those are the questions that tragedy asks.
us to do, and that is very much a political and ethical imperative.
I wanted to make a comment on the title, Tom. I also understood it to be ironic of the session, Pursuit of Unhappiness, because it makes no sense as an end. But I wanted to offer a counter argument if we understand unhappiness as a necessary means to a different end. Already in Aeschylus, we have the idea that wisdom comes through suffering. And Plato works with this very nicely throughout his dialogues, especially in the Gorgias, where he argues that you must go through a punishment in order to arrive at a sense of justice. In other words, your arguments must be refuted. You must suffer the recognition that your previous positions are wrong, and only then will you come to truth. The Stoics elevated the idea of virtue necessarily coming through suffering, and there's some reflection on the impoverishment on the part of Vico, reflection on the impoverishment when certain virtues are no longer needed in society, when we no longer need courage. There is an impoverishment of the human capacity. It continues through Nietzsche, through Thomas Mann. The idea that suffering has an important formative function, which is related to the idea of tragedy. It's just that to view it as the end is absurd, but to recognize it as a means that has an educative function is certainly legitimate, I think.
A good last word for the morning. Thank you very much.
Morning without M-O-R?
No, you. Just formidable. So thank you all very much, and we'll reconvene.